At dinner, my sister pushed a breadbasket toward my son and said, "We didn't order for him." Her voice was calm, as if humiliation were part of the menu. My dad chuckled. "You should have packed him something," he said. Their kids were eating $100 steaks while mine stared at cold bread. I smiled, said one word, and every head at the table turned. They thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. What happened after that dinner didn't just change our family. It exposed what we'd all been pretending not to see. Before I tell you how it unfolded, tell me, where are you listening from? I want to know I'm not the only one who's had to draw a line with family. When people ask what my family is like, I usually say, we're complicated. It's easier than explaining the hierarchy I grew up under, where my parents treated my sister Tessa like glass and me like concrete. I was the stable one, the problem solver, the one they didn't have to worry about. Tessa was the fragile one, the constant work in progress everyone felt obliged to protect. When we were kids, my mom used to say, "Aubrey's strong. She doesn't need much love." I laughed it off then, thinking strength was something to be proud of. Strength has a price. It means when you finally break, no one believes you can. I'm 35 now, a single mom with a 9-year-old son named Ethan. He's quiet and observant, the kind of kid who notices everything but says very little. I work as an administrative manager at a charter school in Tempe, Arizona. My days are emails, lesson schedules, and PTO meetings. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps us safe. My parents live 30 minutes away in Phoenix, in the same house I grew up in. The wallpaper hasn't changed since the 90s, and neither have they. My dad still believes discipline is love. My mom still believes silence keeps the peace. I used to visit every Sunday until the emotional math stopped adding up. The small talk, the sideways comments, the subtle digs that left me drained for days. Tessa is the golden child. She never seems to run out of second chances. She's gone from job to job, boyfriend to boyfriend, always starting over. My parents call her brave for trying new things. When I pay her rent or pick up her kids from school, they call me responsible. It's funny how the same act can look like charity for one person and duty for another. So when my parents invited me to their 45th anniversary dinner, I wanted to believe it was a truce. My mom's text said, "Just family, nothing fancy." I offered to book the restaurant, a nice steakhouse in Scottsdale with soft lighting and private rooms. I even had their 1978 wedding photo restored and framed. I thought maybe, for one night, we could sit at the same table and remember we were on the same side. I didn't realize I was walking straight into the script I'd been cast in since childhood. The one where love had conditions, and respect had limits. The night of the dinner, Ethan and I arrived 5 minutes early. He wore the little navy blazer I'd ironed that morning, his hair combed neat but not babyish. He gripped my hand as we walked through the heavy glass doors. I remember the smell of seared meat, low jazz, and the polite clink of silverware. It felt warm and expensive, almost too polished to be real. Tessa and her family were already there. Her husband Doug had a drink in hand. Their boys were sprawled across the booth, glowing from their tablets. Tessa turned, smiled just enough to be polite, and said, "Oh, hey, you made it." She didn't stand. My mom offered a distracted hug. My dad didn't move. No one looked at the gift bag beside me, the restored photo I'd spent weeks arranging. It sat like an afterthought. I helped Ethan unfold his napkin and whispered, "You can get anything you want." He smiled at the chicken tenders. Simple, safe, something a kid could love. I was about to wave down the waiter when Tessa leaned over and slid the breadbasket toward Ethan. "We didn't order for your son," she said. Mom thought he's a picky eater anyway. For a second, I thought I misheard her. Then my dad added, casual as ever, "You should have packed him something." It wasn't just what they said. It was how easy it sounded. The tone of people so used to dismissing you that they don't even notice anymore. Ethan's shoulders slumped. He didn't cry. He just stared at the bread like it might disappear if he touched it. Something in me cracked, but not loud. Quiet, steady, controlled. I realized, sitting there, that this table had always been the same. Tessa getting seconds, me cleaning the crumbs. I smiled and said one word, "Noted." The sound of it echoed longer than it should have. Tessa looked confused. My dad went back to his steak, but Ethan glanced up. He really looked, and in his small, shy eyes, I saw it. He understood that his mother wasn't going to take it anymore. I didn't say another word. I just waited. A few minutes later, the waiter returned. Notepad ready, smile polite. "Are we all set to order?" he asked. The air felt heavier than the lighting. I could hear Ethan's quiet breathing beside me. My dad was still cutting his steak. My mom scrolled through her phone. Tessa was whispering to Doug. I stood up. The chair scraped loud enough to make the private room fall still. "Actually," I said, calm and steady, "cancel any orders that haven't reached the kitchen yet, and put everything already on the way on my father's tab. It's his anniversary after all." You could hear a pin drop. The waiter froze. Tessa's jaw fell open. My dad finally looked up, fork in midair. "And for my son," I continued, "he'll have the ribeye, medium rare, with truffle fries and a Coke. Make it quick, please." The waiter nodded and disappeared. Ethan looked at me like he wasn't sure whether to smile. I reached over, broke a breadstick, and handed half to him. "Eat, honey," I whispered. "We're fine." Doug cleared his throat. "Was that really necessary?" he asked. I turned to him, calm as glass. Yes, it was. No one else spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of silverware from another room. Uncle Frank, my mother's brother, let out a low chuckle. I hadn't noticed he and Aunt Laura had joined late. Laura's eyes met mine, proud and knowing. She nodded once, like she'd been waiting years to see me do that. Dinner dragged on, stiff and silent. Tessa's boys complained that their food was taking too long. My dad didn't say another word. My mom tried to smile, brittle and tight. When the check arrived, the waiter handed it straight to my father. His face went red, but he didn't argue. As we stood to leave, I pulled the framed wedding photo from the gift bag. Sepia tones, edges softened. They looked like a couple at the beginning of everything. I placed it gently on the table. "Happy anniversary," I said softly, then took Ethan's hand and walked out. Outside, the night air hit cold against my skin. Ethan squeezed my hand and said, small and serious, "You weren't scared." I smiled. "No, baby. I was done." By the time I tucked Ethan into bed that night, my phone was lighting up. Missed calls from Mom, FaceTimes from Tessa, one long voicemail from Dad. I didn't listen. I knew the chorus, "You embarrassed us. You made a scene. You ruined the dinner. For once, I didn't care." Then I got a message from Tessa. "You owe Dad for the dinner. $200. Pay your share." I stared at it, typed one word into the reply, noted, and didn't hit send. I didn't need to. The next morning there was a knock at my door. My parents and Tessa were standing on the porch. They never called first. Dad held an envelope. Mom's lips were pressed so tight they were pale. Tessa had her arms crossed and sunglasses on, though it was cloudy. "Can we come in?" Mom asked, already stepping forward. I didn't answer. I moved aside. Ethan sat on the couch pretending to play his Switch. He looked up, caught my eye, then looked down again. He didn't need to see this, but he'd lived through enough to know how it went. Dad placed the envelope on the kitchen counter with a soft thud. "That's the bill from last night. You agreed to pay half." "You didn't," he said. I leaned against the counter, calm. "Actually, I didn't agree to that. I offered to host, and you turned it into a public shaming. That was your tab. You embarrassed the entire family," Mom said, shaking. "In public, Aubrey. People were watching." Tessa cut in, sharp. "You're delusional. Everyone's talking about it." "You looked crazy," I laughed quietly. "Crazy? You called my son invisible. Maybe that's what crazy looks like to people who can't stand a mirror." Before Tessa could reply, Uncle Frank's truck pulled up. I'd called him 15 minutes earlier and said, "They're here." He'd replied, "We're on our way." When he and Aunt Laura walked in, the room shifted. My mom's face dropped. Dad's eyes narrowed. Frank nodded at me. "You good?" he asked. "Perfect," I said. Laura went straight to the counter, looked at the envelope, then at my parents. "You really came here to collect money from your daughter after what happened?" "This isn't your business," Mom said quickly. Frank crossed his arms. It is when you keep pretending one child's worth more than the other. Tessa scoffed. Oh, please. Here we go again, poor perfect Aubrey. I turned to her, voice level. You know, I've covered your rent for almost a year. I paid your electric bill. I bought your kids Christmas presents. You never said thank you. You just said you'd pay me back soon. Frank slid a stack of papers across the table, photocopies of payments and transfers. I hadn't told him I was saving them, but Laura had suggested I document everything months ago. Tessa went pale. You kept records? She breathed. I keep receipts, I said, for people who forget how much they take. Mom's hand shot up, trembling. Enough. This is private family business, Laura cut in, calm but firm. Then start acting like a family. No one spoke. Even Ethan looked up from the couch. I reached for the envelope on the counter and opened it. Inside was the restaurant invoice, $200, neat handwriting at the bottom, pay your share. I pulled $600 in cash from my wallet and placed it on top. Here's half, I said, not out of guilt. Out of pettiness. I sleep better knowing you didn't get the whole thing. Dad flushed. You're being disrespectful. No, I said steady. I'm being done. I slid the remaining papers from the folder toward them. Proof of every payment I'd ever made to Tessa. Screenshots, transfers, messages. Even a note from the school counselor confirming Ethan was doing fine after their so-called concern report. Mom's face drained of color. Dad clenched his jaw. Tessa trembled. You're pathetic, she said, voice cracking. Dragging everyone down because you can't stand not being the favorite. You were always the favorite, Tessa, I said, stepping closer. You just mistook it for love. The room went quiet. Frank nodded once. That's it. We're done here. I walked to the door, opened it, and waited. They filed out eventually, Dad muttering, Mom with wet eyes, Tessa glaring last. When the door closed, I locked it and leaned my forehead against the wood. I stood there breathing for a long minute. Then my phone buzzed. A voicemail played from an unknown number. This is the Department of Child Services. We received an anonymous report about your son, Ethan. We'd like to schedule a home visit. I froze. By the time the knock came 2 hours later, I'd cleaned every surface, double-checked the fridge, and straightened Ethan's room. The two women at the door were professional and calm. They asked questions, looked around, and smiled at Ethan's art taped to the fridge. One of them said quietly before leaving, We can tell this was a misunderstanding. You'd be surprised how often family does this. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. That night I gathered everything. Copies of payments, messages, photos, and one old letter I found months earlier in a box in the garage. It was my mother's handwriting, dated 35 years back. I don't think I'll ever bond with this second child. I'm too tired to try. I scanned the last line until it blurred. That letter wasn't meant for me to find, but it explained a lot. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Karen, a friend of Laura's. We filed for a formal cease and desist against my parents and Tessa, citing harassment and false reporting. Karen was quick, efficient, and furious on my behalf. A week later, a letter arrived from their attorney. They were filing for grandparent visitation rights, claiming I was denying them access to Ethan out of spite. Karen smirked and said, They don't have a case under Arizona law, but let's make sure they regret trying. We filed a full response with evidence attached, proof of harassment, and the payment trail, and that old letter from my mother. The CPS report was marked unfounded. 3 days later, the case was dismissed. When I told Ethan, he just nodded. So they can't bother us anymore? No, I said. Not anymore. He smiled small but real. That evening, as he colored at the table, I realized it wasn't revenge. It was rescue. Rescue from a family that confused loyalty with obedience and love with control. After the court dismissed their claim, silence settled like clean air after a storm. No calls, no messages, just quiet. I changed the locks the same week and updated my will, naming Uncle Frank and Aunt Laura as Ethan's legal guardians if anything ever happened to me. It felt strange and freeing, like cutting a rope that had been digging into my wrists for years. Doug sent a single text 2 days later, a screenshot of a bank transfer, half the rent I'd covered. No apology, no words. A few minutes later, another message. I'm done with her. Take care of yourself. I stared at it for a long time and then deleted it. He wasn't worth the space in my phone. None of them were. When I saw my mother at the grocery store a week later, she looked smaller and older. She didn't speak. She stood by the produce section, pretending to compare prices on apples. I walked right past her. For the first time in my life, I didn't stop to make her comfortable. At home, Ethan sat on the porch reading. The sunset painted his face gold and orange. You seem different, he said quietly. I am, I told him. He leaned against my shoulder and kept reading. The air was still and peaceful, and for once no one else had the power to ruin it. A few weeks later, Ethan and I drove north to Prescott, just the two of us. We set up a small camp by the lake, roasted marshmallows, and watched the fire crackle. The stars felt endless and untouched by everything we'd left behind. Ethan looked at me and said, soft as the night, "You seem lighter, Mom." I watched the flames dance in his eyes. That's what freedom feels like, I said. For the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just free. If you've ever had to draw a line with family to protect your peace, tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Because I know we're not alone.